we can tell that you have spent quite a lot of time with this particular project there. It looks absolutely crazy good. I keep calling this particular character Sergeant Pepper because I just, for some reason, never quite remember the name of the character there. But perhaps you can actually present to us the project that you've been working on.
Every time I pick up a personal project, I'll try to either develop a new skill, learn a new software, or try a new artistic approach. This time, just fell in love with the self-portrait of John Singer Sargent. Kind of wanted to approach how painters get that kind of change of detail, where like the face is more detailed than everything else, and how to interpret that in 3D, which isn't just don't refine it as much, because that would kind of appear cheap to me, like if I was to do that. Mm-hmm. So I ended up going with rendering the clothing as fog, kind of like transitioning from realistic cloth to like a cloudy, smoky thing. But in the process, I was like, I also kind of want to learn a bit about eyes, because eyes are the most, in my opinion at least, the most important part of a character. I've got an eye that I posted on ArtStation a while ago, but that has like some technical faults with it. It looks okay from a distance. There's some weird stuff going on. Like there's this little bit of the eye right here, which is like completely blowing out to white. And so I was like, okay, I kind of want to spend a bit of time really refining my eye setup and getting something that's like medically accurate. Even though CG, everything's an approximation of an approximation. So it's only so accurate it can go without spending years. I was getting tired of the project towards the end. It had been 5 months of my free time, with a few breaks in there. In terms of actual work, this is 140 hours of work, 108 of which recorded, I believe. Effectively 3 or 4 weeks if I was working on it full time.
That's not that much time, really, when you actually think about it. Like 140 hours, like that's less than my Elden Ring playtime. Which, putting that within perspective, makes me kind of regret some of the choices of my life there. But
and I straight up gave up on matching the reference. Like I did a VFX workflow for modeling where I started off obviously sculpting. I didn't do scans because I can't do a scan of a guy who's been dead for 100 years. There was tiny little things that couldn't quite line up on them because of different focal lengths and distortions, and I could not be bothered to solve that. So I just kind of kept it. Hey, it looks generally like him, but this eye is in the wrong place and not slanted enough, and his mouth is, I think, still 100% symmetrical.
How could you?
Obviously, one of the challenges when you're modeling a self-portrait is, as much as John Singer Sargent is an incredibly talented painter and he's an absolute master of lighting, he definitely beautified himself a little bit. So all of the reference doesn't really look like this image. So that kind of made it difficult when matching it up, because he actually looks more like this. So it's like the planes are a lot softer and his eyes are a lot further forward than what he painted himself. And all of his self-portraits have that. It's like painted a little bit more handsome.
In a way, that's kind of what we all do when we take pictures of ourselves, right? We kind of set the lights in a very specific way so that we look our best. We choose the angles that are going to make our face look at the best as well. Like we're sort of all beautifying ourselves, not just through a painting or like 3D, but like also through like photography and like stuff. So that's pretty much exactly what he did there.
The original selfie filter was absolutely a paintbrush.
I really want to dig deep into the eyes there. I do want to be mindful of your own time, but
that's fine. I don't value my free time.
Spoken like a true character artist.
Yeah. There's a reason I do like hundreds of hours of streams.
Give us like your 5-minute potted history right there so that people who don't know who you are can have a good idea of the kind of work that you do.
Went to university, a place called Bournemouth, and went through basically wanting to do every role at some point. I started off wanting to do animation. So I did 2 years of just downloading rigs and making stuff with it. Then found out I wasn't very good at animation, so I moved on to modeling. Then found out my modeling was passable. I can sculpt organic stuff, but I struggle on like topology and like the techie stuff, at least back then. So then moved on to comp. I've basically tried my hand at every department in VFX. After that, I went into the industry. My first job was at MPC as a groom artist. My first movie was The Greatest Showman.
Better luck with your next job.
Actually, quite a lot of fun to work on. But yeah, after 3 years of groom, I moved to Previs, was a 3D generalist in Previs for 6 months. Then I moved to children's TV where I was a senior Lookdev artist. Children's TV turned out isn't really my thing, but the team was fantastic. Then moved on to actually moving to Montreal to come to MC Episodic, where I was a Lookdev TD again. Did that for almost a year, and now I'm at Digital Domain, where I've been for 2 months at this point.
Could you explain to us what is the exact role of a Lookdev artist?
It is a role that moves around a bit. There are some studios that will call it look development, and what they mean is a different job entirely. But look dev in the typical VFX sense is we create shaders, materials. Let's say you're a modeler or a texture artist. You give us flat colors and geometries which have all the correct shapes. So shading is, or look dev, anytime you're dictating how light reacts to something, you're doing look dev. So texturing is just data for Lookdev to play with, basically. So we can take a sphere and turn it into glass, turn it into metal, turn it into wood, whatever we want. Texturing will give us the color information for that. But yeah, so basically, if it's something that you wouldn't be able to see in flat lighting, it's something that Lookdev has to do. So subsurface is the big example of that, but refraction would also count.
On a typical production, do you also create the textures, or do you have a dedicated texture artist?
It varies heavily between studios. In the case of the studios I've worked at, we are a separate department. We have texture artists. There are times where Lookdev will make their own textures if they have the skill set. It's one of those areas where this is a separate conversation kind of, but it's good to be a generalist sometimes. Even if you're in a specialist role, if you can do other stuff, you're like normally very valuable just to be like, hey, this guy can go do this other thing. We don't need to budget for someone else. Sometimes it would be procedural texturing as well, where the shader is making the color and adding noises and stuff to make it feel like a different thing. You'll notice here that this isn't just maps being plugged in to a shader. That's something that quite a lot of people think, or mainly students will be like, hey, yeah, Lookdev is when you plug your maps into the shader. It's like, well, yes, but also no. More often than not, we will get given, at least in VFX, we'll get given what we call ISO maps or isolation maps. It's just a mask, essentially, black and white. In this case, I didn't make very many. I made one for the T-zone, which is the nose and forehead. I made one for the blackheads, which just allows me to darken the skin color. And I made one for the wetness, which allows me to add a little bit of like water layer around the eye and stuff. I very much recommend getting into the habit of you paint your textures, but you paint them with the mindset of, hey, I can adjust these in my shader as well. I can augment them. I can add stuff together. Because if you try to do everything in texture, every time you want to make any change, you have to go back to your textures, re-export it, repaint, whatever you need to do. If you've got textures that are a solid base and you augment them in shader, it's much, much faster feedback, which is normally where Lookdev we spend most of our time. It's extremely rare for me to work on a shader where I don't like hue shift or saturate or desaturate texturings work. Because ultimately, if I make this more reflective, all that color is going to look completely different now. So we have to adjust everything back and forth.
There's people who's in charge of doing the modeling, and there's people who are in charge of doing the texturing. Mm-hmm. And there's other people who are in charge of doing, let's say, the lighting for a particular shot. And you're kind of in the middle of all of those different, and you're sort of bringing all of that together in a way, right?
We make sure that what the modelers and texture artists do reacts the way that lighting expect it to. Because if shaders do a bad job, lighting, when they light something, it won't react correctly. Like if you got a room that's entirely made of metal, and you put the same light in it, it's going to look completely different from a room that's like padded. The light is the same, the lighting is doing the same stuff, but if that shader is wrong, lighting will not get what they want, and then client and comp won't get what they want, and it just ricochets through.
So you're sort of the glue in the middle of all these different people doing all these different disciplines there, yeah. After
what we do, you move into shot-based work, where you've got lighting where they don't light for an asset, they light for a sequence, they light for an environment. So we're that last step before you're like, hey, this isn't assets anymore. This is this other thing. It's one of those where every single department is incredibly important to the next one in line. And eventually we all work in service of comp. So yeah, the job of Lookdev is just to make sure what lighting do reacts the way we all expect. And then if they get that, they can do something great for comp, and then they can do something great for client and editing and every other step that's in between that we always forget about.
Let's talk about the eyes then. I really want to get into that, yeah.
Very quick disclaimer, and I encourage you to definitely keep this in the footage. This was entirely self-indulgent and made my life hell. You can go insane with accuracy, but the amount of control it gives you, it also takes away in other places. Like painting maps for this is a nightmare. And the moment this deforms would be even worse.
I love the renders, by the way, where you can see like the red in like the back there. Perhaps you could actually set up the stage. What have you done here, and why is this so special?
I watched an unhealthy amount of medical videos, which means I've seen some things I'm not going to unsee. I just wanted to see, hey, like with eyes, we normally oversimplify them because they are inherently extremely complex. What happens if we just go, fuck it, and just try to make it as it is? So I wasn't watching tutorials. I wasn't watching other people's approaches. I was just like, how is an eye built? Like, what is the shapes? There's some simplifications I've had to make, and there's definitely people out there who've done way more complex versions than me. I've not seen them, but there's no way this is the most complex eye out there. It's overly simplistic in a few areas, not in terms of modeling, but in terms of the shading. There's some variation that I just didn't add that I should have. All of the texturing for this entire eye, except the sclera, is this. This is the only map for the iris. Every other detail is geometry. So all the fibers within the eye, all that sort of stuff is pure geometry.
And this is for coloring, by the way, like the texture that you just shown us here is to get a little bit of a different color.
So that map will be easy to explain once I've talked about what stroma is, but it's controlling the density of the structure of the iris. We'll talk about the bits of anatomy everyone does know. So you got the sclera, which is the white of the eye. You got the cornea, which is the clear dome over your iris. You've got the iris, and you've got the pupil. That's the bits that everyone always has in their stuff. The way they approach a pupil might change. You might do a black texture, or you might just make a hole. Up to you. You also have the meniscus and the caruncula, which a lot of people are aware of, but might not know a name for. Caruncula is the fleshy bit in the middle. Meniscus is the wet layer around the eye. My meniscus is something I'm not very happy with. I kind of want to fix it, but it's too late now. This project is long gone for me. The bits where people don't normally do is the cornea has a physical thickness. It's not this like infinitely deep thing that goes all the way to the back of the eye. It has a variable thickness as well. So the very front of the cornea is slightly thinner than the sides. So inside that is a fluid. That fluid has a very slightly different index of refraction. It's called the aqueous humor, this fluid, and it's what supplies your eyes with all the nutrients. The fluid inside the eye is doing that job for you.
That actually makes a difference, because like when you look at eyes from like 3/4 or from like a profile, you can clearly see that there is refraction happening there. It's not, you're not just seeing through it as if the cornea was just a pane of glass and then it was hollow on the inside. You can actually see, if you look at an eye from like a 3/4 from like a profile, you can see that the iris starts to get really distorted, you know, like as if you're actually looking at like something within a bathtub there, you know, like we tend to just like fake it. But in your case, you're like, no, like I'm going to do this so that this is as physically accurate as it can.
In VFX, that refraction is actually kind of the standard. Like we have the render budget to always do refraction. The difference to this setup is normally that refraction, we just do one thin mesh. Well, technically not thin mesh because it closes at the back, but one layer of polygons at the front. And then it has effectively a glass or a water shader on it, which will do the refraction for us. And that is fine. It works fine. Doesn't need to change, and definitely simplifies the entire process. But in reality, the cornea's got a thickness and it's got this fluid behind it. From a distance, will still look pretty much the same as refracting a single layer. But in real life, there's different indices of refraction where the cornea is bending light one way and then the fluid is bending it slightly a different way. There's also a structure called the lens, which is obviously in the pupil. Makes very little difference. I've added it anyway. For me, it helps with the red eye effect. Go to this. It helps me get the correct fall off. Granted, there's a little bit fakery happening here. My guy would be completely colorblind because there was a render bug I couldn't get rid of without coloring the lens red or tinting it red. The eye refracts red naturally, but I had to enhance it because it was blowing out to white for some reason. But yeah, so we have cornea, the actual geometry that's building this. We have cornea, lens, fluid, which is just the cornea scaled in with a very slight overlap. One of the things with CG rendering of fluids, something that people will be aware of if they've done like a glass of water or something, the water has to overlap the glass or the cornea in this case, because otherwise the renderer doesn't know how to handle it. It's called, the actual name for it is nested dielectrics, basically a nerd term for light doesn't hit the glass and then have a gap before hitting the water. It goes directly into it. So it bends the light by this IOR minus this one, blah, 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 cool maths. Stuff that I don't understand. There's a physics side of it, which is wild. The renderer will handle it for you as long as you've got that overlap and correct IORs on all the objects, which you can find the values for very easily. But yeah, so we have this. Now, because this has a thickness, the refraction wouldn't look correct on its own. it would actually not refract enough. So you'd end up with an eye that doesn't really change. It would look more like transparency. So that's why if you do a thickness, you have to have the fluid on the inside. Otherwise, it's not going to work. I'm going to... So there's the shapes a little bit more clear. So I've made it slightly thinner at the front, just because that's the way it is in real life. The blend between the cornea and sclera in real life is one continuous bit of tissue. The cell structure changes, but it's still one continuous piece. So you would never break that as a separate geometry. Yeah. The blend itself has a specific name called Limbus, Limbus, which is the dark rings you get around eyes. In some eyes is the limbus having a color. In most cases, it's going to be blue or black. The iris blends to the back of the limbus. It's like one continuous piece. So this is an area where my model is making an approximation, because screw modeling that all as one piece, it would be a nightmare to shade and texture. So we have a mesh that gets thicker towards where it meets the iris. They overlap slightly, and that just allows me to have this blend be a little bit more organic without showing the same mesh twice. We are doing two surfaces essentially. Like if you texture transparency, there's still that gap in between where there's physically nothing, and you're not going to render a fog inside that. It'd be way too heavy. You have to kind of offset that transparency on the inside, which in real life you don't do. In this case, what that meant is I have like a map that goes from cornea to sclera, and then that map is essentially just saying, adding the transparency, adding the refraction. I use that same map to just tint the sclera, so that because it's the same map, as it blends, it subtly shifts in color towards that blue or black, which means in your renders, you get the black shadow here, but the nice subsurface here. This is something that's missing in a lot of people's renders, because they just color it all black, or they don't color it at all. We naturally get, like, whenever the lighting's dim, you get these black rings even stronger. That is coming just from coloring the sclera, and the shader handles the rest. When the light hits it, it's able to pass through it a little bit because it is still transparent. Then you get the subsurface, and it blends back in. And it gives quite a natural fall off, which you only see at glancing angles. It's always there, but you see it more at glancing. It's quite important to how someone reads an eye. And it's one of those things that if you ask someone to draw an eye, they'll always do the gradient, but they won't always do this or the glow that you get on the opposing side. And that's the sort of stuff where if you build something physically, you get that, and you don't even have to think about it. It just happens. In VFX, we can kind of just build things as they are, and sometimes we get happy side effects of, hey, this actual physical phenomenon is now happening because we're just simulating light going through something that is as close to reality as we can get it. A great example of that being the whole deneg, double negative, and interstellar thing, where their rendering of a black hole became actually informative to the scientific community because they were doing crazy stuff that people just didn't try before that.
We're explorers, huh? This is our boat.
VFX occasionally stumbles into that. Most of the time, we're faking stuff too, so we don't find stuff like that all the time. But it's one of the areas where the two kind of workflows of optimize versus build as is and suffer with the render times. That's where they kind of differ so much. So the iris, in terms of its structure, quite complex, but there's three parts that CG artists have to care about. You have the stroma, which is the colored bit. You have the fibers within the eye, which are all like your little muscle fibers and that sort of stuff. And you have the back of the iris. I can't remember if it's got a name. There's a part of it that you can see that does have a name, which you can see in this render, this little brown ring. This is called the pupillary rough. Everyone has it, but not always completely visible. This is the back of your iris wrapping around the pupil. There's a really cool fact about this with eye colors, but I'll get to that in a moment. But basically, the stroma lets light through quite easily. Your eye, the entire function of it is to get rid of light except for the pupil so you can focus. So if light was going completely through your iris, it'd be really hard to focus. So the back of the iris is heavily pigmented. Like, light does not get through that thing. It's, I think, the most pigmented part of the body. Like, it's so dense. And that just basically acts as a light blocker. Nothing can get through it. The reason that's important is because different eye colors allow different amount of light through. Blue eyes, effectively what you're getting is light is able to go completely through it and just hits the back of the eye. With darker eyes, light doesn't get through it as far. That becomes important in one very small way, which is something you can apply to your eye texturing if you're just doing polygons. Those fibers that are inside the eye are physically inside that stroma. You shouldn't be able to see all these fiber lines when you've got brown eyes. They are hidden. They are completely opaque. So if we go to, for example, this eye, you've got blue, and you can see all these fibers that are inside it. But the moment you get any bit that's brown, you can't see these fibers anymore. And that's because the melanin is blocking all that light. So if you see a brown eye texture so if you see a brown eye texture which has all these fibers drawn on, it's not physical. It's not how it works. Which is why a pet peeve of mine, which is something I fell into myself, when people make an eye out of groom, it's completely not how eyes are built. Groom is in the eye, but it isn't the eye. So the fibers on the inside is something I did in groom. So I have in my scene very horrific setup, which is this. If I hide the stroma, these are being rendered as geometry in Arnold, but I did this using Yeti. Basically, I just have a little pipe on the pupil, grow hairs out from there to like the length that would be required, and then just add some random wibbles. This isn't physically accurate at all to how they should be, but it'd be very painful to do it any other way. I would need it to attach at all these different points, and that would be a nightmare. This is actually deceptively simple to set up. It's literally just a fully procedural, no guide curves, hair grow out.
From the center outward, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And this is like pretty much entirely symmetrical, which isn't how eyes are, but this is one of those areas where I was like, it's not worth the time. So I could just grow it all out the same length. This middle structure we see here, this little guy. So that is the pupillary rough that I was talking about earlier, the back of the iris. This is shading like basically subsurface, but very, very dark. And now the whole thing about being able to see it, we saw it in a reference a moment ago. So this person's is quite pronounced. This is one of those small things where regardless of your eye color, this will be brown because it has to be. Every eye will have this. It's just a case of, is it exposed? In this case, this person's is recessed. You can see a little bit of it here. It's a little
bit of it there, yeah.
Yeah. It's also quite a chaotic structure. Some people are more pronounced than others. This person's is very pronounced. If you search pupillary rough, you'll mostly get images of people with like distorted roughs where it's like actually affecting their vision. You'll all have this. And this is, from what I can tell, where the fibers or a lot of the fibers attach. It's like a little lip for them to grab onto. Structurally, it's actually insanely simple, but it's cool stuff. In terms of the stroma, so this has a few requirements. I've kept it high poly. I didn't need to worry about optimizing it. This isn't strictly necessary. I just wanted to have areas that kind of overlap, and I didn't want to bother with vector displacement. So I have areas of the mesh where it kind of goes under itself.
Did you hand sculpt that, by the way?
Yeah, hand sculpted. So I've got it in ZBrush. I do have displacement to add all this stuff in as well. If I just go get rid of the cornea, get rid of the fluid. There you go.
What about those fibers that I can see that you sculpted?
The stroma is naturally distorted quite heavily by the fibers. So this isn't necessarily sculpting the fibers themselves. This is sculpting the effects of the fibers on the iris. Now, there's a few things that for my guy's eyes I didn't add, but something that would, strictly speaking, be more accurate is to have, I can't remember what they're called, but there's forms that everyone has. You have like wrinkles, which look really, really cool. I had it in my last project, so I just never added it to this one. Normally I do that as a separate map, so I'll have it like tuned in displacement. But yeah, so we got all that stuff going on. Obviously, we've got the Limbus, not Limbus, sorry, the pupillary rough, which is just a noise added to it to get some kind of variation. They look weird if you don't add some kind of breakup to them. But yeah, so this is all hand sculpted. Took like, I think 4 hours, 5 hours. And yeah, there's one inaccuracy kind of, which is this outer layer technically should be a different geometry. It makes like -0 difference. It's completely kind of irrelevant to how it shades. So I just figured it's not worth having to deal with two geometries that overlap that way. But I mean, in a way, you can kind of see a more conventional eye setup in this mesh right now, where it's just like one piece and it all blends together. It's just that mine's physically separate. So if we go there, that's like what's happening there. But yeah, so I've kept that all as one geometry, which is just zero meshed. I didn't need to worry about it. One of the limitations, because we're rendering this as a volume, UVs are completely irrelevant. So any maps that you do have to be projected in the shader. They have to be happening at render time. So every single eye for this character has a camera parented to it, so that in my setup, I have a camera that's always following the iris, and that just allows me to paint a map that will always track it. That's the density map thing I showed you earlier. That's what this camera's for, so that I don't have to worry about always lining up cameras to the eye. This just comes with it. But yeah, so the actual construction AI, that's it. Obviously the lens is back there. I didn't need to add all the fibers that connect this up. Naturally, there's muscle fibers that pull us apart. And there's also another very subtle thing about the lens, which is the middle of it. So like the physical middle, not like from the surface, has a different index of refraction from the surface. That affects how your eye, like as the lens gets stretched out to like focus on different things, that differing IOR helps you focus. But in CG, we can't do that. Like I don't think there's actually any way to do that right now, because we calculate everything at the surface rather than as it travels through. But that's something that would have very, very little effect. Although for some reason I've memorized the numbers. If you're curious, the front of the lens is 1.386 and the middle of the lens is 1.406. A very small difference, but actually does change how the red eye effect looked when I tested it. But in terms of geometry, that's it. So it's obviously a complex eye setup, but I don't think a single step of this is difficult.
No, but it's very laborious. And to get to this, there's also quite a lot of research involved in the back of this to even get to this point, So I imagine that the research probably even took you longer than the actual modeling part.
Yeah. And there's one actually quite big thing there before I forget. The eye isn't circular. This is something I never bothered to add because it just adds so much complexity. Like if you was to overdo it kind of flat at the front, it's a bit of a nightmare. Like I wouldn't want to rig with that. But the eye is flatter at the front than it is at the back. But it's something I don't think is worth adding to any setup, to be honest. It's just something to be aware of. If you wanted to do something like more accurate, you'd need that flatness at the front.
Beyond that, have you noticed or have you paid attention to the iris also not being either not necessarily fully circular when you look at it from front, but being slightly tilted naturally towards one angle?
So you're right. One of the big things is the eye doesn't face forward; it faces 3 degrees outwards. So this eye is facing 3 degrees that way. This eye is facing 3 degrees that way. That is something that if people do in their models, stops it from looking cross-eyed all the time. And it's just 3 degrees rotation. It's really actually quite easy. In terms of the actual asymmetry, so there's a few things that happen there. First is astigmatism, which is the cornea itself also isn't round. It's in most people slightly taller than it is wide. So that's called astigmatism, which is technically a defect in your eye, but most people have one. The way to tell if you have one, if you remember being a kid and like you're driving past streetlights and you're looking up at these like streetlights and you have that like lightning bolt shape, if you see that, you've got astigmatism. If your eye is perfectly circular, it will just be a light. There won't be anything else coming off it. Iris itself, it's hard to say if it's in the center or not because the eye rotation is going to define where center is in this case, but pupil is very rarely in the middle. It's normally off to the side slightly. Like normally one side of the iris is longer than the other. That's something that I did not bother to do. There's loads of elements of asymmetry in the eye, which are really, really fun. I mean, the most obvious is the crypts. So like, well, there's 2 names for them. There's crypts for the small ones. There's a different word for the big ones.
Tails from the crypts, yeah.
Yeah, there's another word that begins with L, which is specifically for big crypts. So I think like this here would be a crypt, but this would be the other one.
Or a large crypt.
The medically accurate statement. But yeah, so those are obviously a very, very obvious version of asymmetry, and they are really fun to sculpt, actually. Yeah, the eye is covered in asymmetries. A really helpful thing for this, actually, Disney have a YouTube channel called the Disney Research Group, and like 7 years ago, they did a video on capturing eyes with refraction, like actually finding a way to scan eyes so they get the structure of the iris without refraction. And that shows very heavily actually how distorted the iris is when you don't factor in this curved ball in front of it. It's really wild looking. And it's on YouTube, completely free to look at. The eye itself renders, it looks quite out of date now. Like the shaders are quite simplified, but the geometry is insane.
I think it would be worth to mention too, by the way, just for like people watching this after the fact, okay? You don't normally have to go to this level of detail when you're doing eyes, okay?
Yeah.
Like, in fact, like even when you do eyes for games, and I know quite a lot of projects who actually work like this, they will actually model eyes with only one single mesh, and they will fake everything in there through like the shader. So like iris itself is like not even a separate mesh. It's actually just a kind of parallax that is applied on the actual eyeball mesh itself to get the iris looking like somewhat concave in there, you know? Someone watching this who is actually thinking like, oh my God, I need to go to this level of detail for the eyes of my characters. Like, no, some of us, we just love to like geek out and push things as far as we can, you know? And that's just what's going on here, you know?
And even if you do want to be a VFX artist and you're looking at this like, oh, we do this. No, we don't. VFX, we don't care to this level. Like this, as I said at the start, is a very self-indulgent, like, I want to research something. The whole volume thing makes it so difficult to work with. Although it shades nice, this iris is quite simple. There's a lot of details that are missing from this. And that is because of how hard it was to work with. But it was a fun experiment. It was fun to like learn about all this stuff, like get the Pupillary rough and all that sort of stuff. I actually recommend against doing this, unless you're a seasoned Lookdev artist and you're like, I just want to try it, then go for it. It's fun. If you're looking at this and you're feeling intimidated because eyes are complex, don't be. This is completely wholly unnecessary and would be recommended against even within VFX. But it's fun if you want to try it.
Perhaps I would actually ask you if you could actually repeat that particular red eye effect. If you could like synthesize that once more, like how is that created?
So this is achieved entirely within render. As I said earlier, there's a tiny bit of fakery happening, but the red eye effect is there without that bit of fakery. What you're seeing when you see a red eye effect is you see it more often in camera flashes than you do any other lighting scenario. The reason for that is because the light is coming from roughly the same angle of where you're seeing the eye from. So what you're actually seeing is not some like phenomenon. It's just the back of the eye. Like you're seeing the retina. So in real terms, you're just seeing this bit back here. The reason you don't see this all the time is because all this refraction at the front means that for a light to like hit back here and then reach you again, it has to go like straight through. If it goes even remotely off to the side, you're not seeing it, which is why this lighting is from the front, but you don't get any red eye effect. And this lighting is a few degrees lower and you get the red eye effect. In terms of how it's achieved in shader, it's completely a result like building it accurately. So because I have a sclera which is painted red on the inside, and because I have the refraction at the front which is roughly the correct shape and thickness, you naturally get that effect because it's just a light simulation. There's many ways to fake it. If you're just doing a single render with a camera flash effect, just add some emission, add some glow. It's so much easier. Yeah, I mean that's effectively what you're seeing. In terms of the fakery I added, so I actually got a few messages telling me I should take my friend to the hospital because he's got an eye disease. I had my lens colored white, which is the correct color because you don't want it to filter any light through it. The problem I was getting, and I never fully resolved it, was something inside the eye is reflecting white. I don't know where it's coming from because I tried removing meshes one at a time and it just appeared. Like if I rendered any of them individually, it wasn't there. But the moment I combine them, it appears. So to get rid of that, I just got the lens and tinted it red. So we're naturally killing off the light that's coming back out. Again, that would make him completely colorblind in real life. Given time, I might have found what it was, but I didn't want to dedicate that kind of time. The reason I said the whole thing of, take your friend to the doctor, if you have a camera flash that gives you anything other than a red eye, you have some kind of degeneration inside your eye and you actually should go get checked. If you have yellow or white, it's a sign of eye cancer, typically. The reason I got those messages is because he technically right now is rendering as if he has eye cancer, which if I did that, that's one, really sick, two, unbelievably technically complex.
Leave out no details.
Yeah. Leave out no details. I need to get all of his genetics in here. If you're not rendering DNA chains, are you even a Lookdev artist?
I think we have quite a lot of things that we can learn from all of you on the VFX side, and I really want to thank you for your time, by the way. I think you've been extremely generous, both with your time and with all the knowledge that you have shared here. So I think a lot of people will learn quite a lot of things from this. So I really want to say a big thank you, not only for me, but for everyone else who is going to watch this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time. Before we do wrap this up, perhaps you can let people know who are going to watch this where they can follow you, where they can see more of your work.
I've got like ArtStation, Instagram, and all that stuff. My main kind of place, I live stream like about 80% of what I do. This character, about 140 hours of work, but 108, I believe, are still on YouTube as recordings. Going from, starting from a sphere, modeling up, going through, and it's like every project I do the same thing. If you want very unfiltered knowledge to crawl through, there's some stuff in there that might be helpful if you can find it. But yeah, that's on my YouTube channel, Mike Cauchi Art. Same name as my website, which has some tutorials, like room tutorials. Some stuff I wrote while I was still a student is more like pipeline-y based things, like XGen pipeline for beginners is in there. And yeah, and then Instagram and ArtStation stuff, those can be found quite easily through the YouTube and website.
We're going to leave a list of links that people can follow to see more of your work. And
thank you.
You are working on a new character too, right?
Character called Mona. I'm working with a student who's really talented concept artist. I wanted to kind of work with her. So yeah, doing more of a cloth focus on her. She's not supposed to be hyper real. It's more of a stylized thing. Still some realistic elements, but eyes will be a lot more simple. I'm thinking of doing the eyes without pupils as well, like just doing just an iris the whole way, see what I can make out of that. Streaming the whole process is a bit of work I've done off stream. Whenever I do work off YouTube streams, I tend to do it in Discord instead. Well, just live streams to a small group of people where I can actually talk to them and they can talk back. Yeah, that project's been done. Whole thing, well, 80% of it will be on stream, and recordings will probably stay up for a long time.
It's been great. Thank you so much.